Hello and welcome everybody. Hi, this is the UCCS Speaker Series. It's the second session of our series this academic year. I'm Richard Kravitz, I'm director here at UC Center. And as we mentioned last week, our focus this year is on three broad themes. One involving climate change and its impact on fire, drought, and flooding. A second on technological breakthroughs for solving California's biggest problems, and finally the future of artificial intelligence, which will be the focus of a special symposium that the center will host during the winter quarter. Today's talk's not directly related to these themes, but it's rather adjacent to it. All of us eat, and how and what we eat influences our health, and in turn is influenced by a variety of forces, including weather patterns, disaster resilience, trade relations, and local conditions, including land use planning. In particular, promoting food access for under-resourced communities is critical to food justice. So to talk about these issues in the context of California's SB 1000, we're very pleased to welcome Charisma AC. She's an associate professor at the UC Berkeley Department of City and Regional Planning, and also faculty director at the Berkeley Food Institute and research director of Berkeley's Institute of Urban and Regional Development. Her work focuses on local and regional environmental sustainability with a focus on poverty reduction, urban governance, environmental justice, and access to basic services. She earned her PhD in urban planning from UCLA, and she's the author of many peer-reviewed articles covering topics ranging from global health to environmental justice, urban agroecology, a new word for me, and food sustainability. So please join me in welcoming Charisma AC.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz, and thanks to everyone here at the UC Center Sacramento for hosting me and all of the students that have joined us today who are here and also coming from UC Berkeley and all of you on Zoom. So I'm really excited to be talking about California's landmark environmental justice bill, Senate Bill 1000, and how we can advance equity and food access in planning through this new law, relatively new law. I'm going to jump right in and start talking about a part of this research was motivated by exploring the connections between environmental justice and food justice, parallel movements that really speak to issues affecting the same communities that have been impacted by past discriminatory laws shaping health outcomes today. The environmental justice movement itself sparked in Warren County, North Carolina, when a rural Black community fought the creation of a toxic landfill back in 1982. And that fight was part of a growing awareness nationwide that communities of color, low-income communities, were being deliberately targeted for undesirable land uses. This was something that Robert Bullard, who's considered the father of the environmental justice movement, raised awareness of back in the 1970s. And planning has had a role in that. Exclusionary zoning, discriminatory siting decisions disproportionately has exposed low-income communities and neighborhoods of color to environmental hazards. And also, not only that, has shaped the lack of access to environmental amenities like green space or fresh food in communities as well, which has had disparate health impacts. And so these are just some of the images of community-based organizations who are doing the work to advance environmental justice in California and who have been behind bills like Senate Bill 1000, as well as Assembly Bill 617, which is another environmental justice bill that requires regional air districts to partner with communities with poor air quality and create community emissions reductions plans and air monitoring plans. Both of which are, both bills, AB 617, Senate Bill 1000, are really important new laws for advancing environmental justice, especially for a movement that comes out of the history of civil rights and protesting and activists having to fight from the outside to change laws. Now we have a chance to integrate environmental justice into our laws and prevent a lot of future harms for communities and our futures. So environmental justice on one hand, food security on the other. So there's multiple definitions of food security. For the USDA, food security is defined at the household level, right? Access to enough food for every person to live an active, healthy life. But activists who have made the connection between environmental justice and food security lift up the concept of community food security, which links food availability, access, and use to regional land use, transportation, and public health. It highlights inequalities where groups lack continuous physical and economic access to nutritious food, culturally relevant food, and to opportunities to grow food that would contribute to active, healthy living. And this is important because challenges to accessing healthy food can lead to higher risk of chronic disease, such as obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. And when people can't either buy food at a local grocery store or grow or obtain locally grown fresh foods. And so often alternatives in a lot of communities are a lot of processed foods and just no access to fresh produce that's essential for longevity. So this project really seeks to connect food justice and environmental justice. And here I have an image from Oakland's general plan, one of the newest cities to develop their environmental justice element. And in there, this is one aspect of the analysis, the kind of analysis that cities and counties around the state are now doing as part of Senate Bill 1000. They were looking at the location of markets by size and whether they provide fresh food and where they're located throughout the city in terms of size, square footage, and distribution. And if you know anything about Oakland, a lot of population and low-income population is in the east, the east side of Oakland, anyway, which is on the right side of your screen, and you would notice that there's fewer markets on the right side, kind of towards the bottom right of your screen. And those are the flats of Oakland where a lot of working class communities and communities of color live. And there's an abundance of markets more on the northern side of the city where more affluent residents live. So there's clearly a disparity in terms of access to fresh food. Similarly, our research was not only interested in looking at food access, but how environmental justice impacts our food producing communities in California. So this is a map of Cal-Enviro-Screen. How many of you in the room have heard of Cal-Enviro-Screen? Most folks have. Okay, so Cal-Enviro-Screen is an amazing tool which classifies at the census tract level pollution burden for every census tract in California. It consists of about 21 different indicators that measures socioeconomic characteristics as well as like levels of PM 2.5, particulate matters in the atmosphere, and health, like asthma and prevalence of cardiovascular disease, and aggregates all of those indicators into an index. And so any census tract that's in the 75th percentile of Cal-Enviro-Screen is designated a disadvantaged community according to Senate Bill 535. So 75th percentile communities as well as tribal communities are under this nomenclature of disadvantaged communities in California. We talk about that term, we're not in love with it, but it's the term under the law. It also makes those communities eligible for a lot of funding for cap and trade. There's laws in California that connect a portion of cap and trade. Funding must be designated and spent in and for disadvantaged communities. Things like Assembly Bill 2722, transformative climate communities, and other bills. So it's an important law, and that designation is really important in terms of qualifying for funding that can address environmental justice issues in community. And what we see here on this screen, you see a lot of red. We're zoomed out, so those are big census tracts, right? That are less densely populated, but a lot of that goes down the central part of California in our farm growing communities in the Central Valley. And we know that in the central coast of California, the Central Coast, but also the Central Valley, we have some of the highest rates of asthma and other kinds of public health burdens in the state. So, and you have the irony that our food growing communities also, on top of that, suffer from lack of food access as well. So we're interested in both food access overall, but also how this bill could be benefiting our farm worker communities in the central part of the state. So what is Senate Bill 1000, the Planning for Healthy Communities Act? It was signed into law in September 2016 and took force from January 2018, and it requires those cities with disadvantaged communities to incorporate environmental justice policies into their general plans. A general plan is a blueprint for a community in terms of future development. It lays out the land use policies, it specifies what lands, where new development is going to take place, where new housing and where infrastructure needs to go to support population growth. It also specifies what lands are going to be conserved and preserved, increasingly important in terms of our concerns with climate change and sustainability. It covers things like circulation, hazard prevention, and everything else. So the word element is just another word for topic in terms of the law. So any city or county that has a disadvantaged community needs to incorporate an environmental justice element into their general plan. And the law is triggered when a city is updating 2 or more elements of their general plan. So cities tend to update their plans about every 15 to 20 years in terms of a wholesale update of their plan, but often they will update, some elements of their plan at a time. And so if they're updating 2 or more, then this law is triggered. And so we were interested, if you look at Senate Bill 1000, it has 9 goals, right? Reducing pollution exposure, promoting access to public facilities, food access, safe and sanitary homes, physical activity, community engagement, prioritizing programs that address the needs of disadvantaged communities, equitable development and design, and reducing the impacts of climate change. And number 3 is food access. So my colleague Susana Matias and I thought about, wow, with this new law, let's see what cities are doing to both address food access, and eventually if we could catalog, all of the interventions that cities are doing under this new law, we could start to measure what measurable impact on nutrition and health outcomes. And that's a future goal of this project. So we were excited that food access is baked right into this law, which gave us a point of intervention. And so you can see on this slide some of the examples of policies that could be, that cities could adopt as part of Senate Bill 1000. Under each of these different goals. And so these are example policies from the guidelines from the Governor's Office of Planning and Regulation. So creating opportunities to access affordable nutritious foods, protecting and expanding urban agriculture, and setting up school programs that integrate gardening and nutrition. So those are examples of some of the policies that cities could incorporate. So this is, what I was talking about in terms of how California defines disadvantaged communities, but it doesn't stop there. So CalEnviroScreen is an important tool, but it's a kind of, it's a broad brush in a sense. There's a lot more inequality or inequities at the local level that are specific to particular communities. And so what the law also says is that cities can customize CalEnviroScreen. So you can actually look under the hood. You don't have to just use the aggregated census tract. You can look at each of the 21 variables that make it up and use that to guide your identification of disadvantaged communities, or you can come up with other methodologies relevant to your local community to identify low-income areas and impacted communities. So they encourage cities to go beyond CalEnviroScreen and come up with analyses that are relevant and customized to their local community. There's a great new toolkit that a urban planning firm, Diet and Batia, has come out to help the County of San Bernardino, and it's available at sb1000toolkit.com. I just heard about it on the webinar that was recently held with Mike Mendez and others who've also been looking at Senate Bill 1000 and its implementation across California. And that's a great new toolkit that can help communities with, aggregating different kinds of indicators that can be relevant to their community. And why you need to go beyond the CalEnviroScreen SB 535. This is just an example from a map. This is from a different project, but there are different definitions of equity that different agencies use. So you have Senate Bill 535 on one hand, the Bay Conservation Development Commission, BCDC, here in the Bay, uses social vulnerability, and you can see there's not a perfect overlap, right, between SB 535 and social vulnerability. Our Metropolitan Transportation Commission, MTC, which is our regional transportation planning agency, has equity priority communities. So you have all of these different types of inequities that have been identified by different public agencies. So it's important to use measures that are local and relevant to your particular community. So our research questions for this project were four. One, how is food access implemented in cities' general plans under SB 1000? What kind of food access projects, policies, and programs are being implemented? And we chose two cities that seem to have pretty robust food access policies. City of Richmond, it's in an urban area here in the Bay Area, and the city of Gilroy, also in the Bay, but in a rural community. And then what level of engagement did community members have in the planning and implementation of these policies, and what other factors have influenced what policies were adopted and implemented? So those are our research questions going in. And we started with looking at general plans across California. We started initially, there's a wonderful database maintained by Professor Catherine Brinkley and her shop at UC Davis, and which is a searchable database of general plans across California. What we wanted to do was to be able to pull specific policies, and I'll show you a snapshot of our database in a second, from each of those general plans. And so Katie Fallon, who's a Master of City Planning graduate from UC Berkeley's Department of City Regional Planning, amazing young professional who now works for BCDC, was our primary researcher on this project, and helped us locate every general plan in California and identify not only the most recent plan, which wasn't always easy. Not every city posts their plan and makes it easy for the public to access. Sometimes you had to call localities and find those plans and where they were. Not every plans may be in PDF, but it may not be searchable. So it was a lot to assemble this database. And then after identifying the plan, she went through and found all of the food policies, and then started the process of identifying whether cities had actually implemented SB 1000 or not. So we were able to see to what extent cities had food policies before SB 1000, and how did the passage of SB 1000 impact the food policies that cities developed. So kind of a pre and post. And then we were also looking, like we said, at the specific policies. So, coming up with terms, to search the general plans like food, market, agriculture, garden, health, in order to identify those policies. And then we came up with many months of talking as a research team with Susanna and Katie. We came up with a way to categorize each of these existing policies. And one thing we're really looking at is to what extent do these policies really address equity? And this is something I talk about in my class a lot, because a lot of people, there's a difference between equality or giving everyone the same or wanting to guarantee access to all, and recognizing disparities, right? In order to reach equality, you have to recognize existing disparities and differences in needs, opportunities, access, and resources, right? And so to what extent did these policies really address equity? So like I said, we wanted to look at equity, which is number 6 here. And then after looking at all the policies, we grouped them under 5 categories. So we got to see, food access, which is, the goal in SB 1000, but we were also looking kind of more holistically in terms of how cities were adopting or addressing food access through SB 1000. So we also looked for policies around nutrition outcomes, local food production, edible landscapes, and protection of agricultural land. So these are like some of the categories in our database. So, where the municipality is, the county it's in, when was the general plan last updated, a link to the latest version of the general plan, and then whether or not the plan has, if the law has been triggered, have the requirements of SB 1000 been met, is another thing that we were looking for, which you'll see it turns out to be significant, is does the plan have a separate standalone environmental justice element, or is it incorporated throughout the plan? So Senate Bill 1000 leaves it up to cities. It says cities, you could either integrate environmental justice throughout your general plan, or you can have it as a standalone element. And so we'll see whether or not that makes a difference, but that's one thing we were looking at. And then is the city in compliance? And we, over the course of this project, we met with the Office of the Attorney General and their Bureau of Environmental Justice, the Governor's Office of Planning and Regulation, to share our findings and also to make sure we fully understood the law and when SB 1000 is triggered, to make sure we were correctly, assigning whether or not cities had implemented or not their obligations under the new law. So this is just a snapshot of what our database looks like, and it's now available on the BFI website. So after today's presentation, there's links if you want to access the database and look for it yourself. It's a project we're gonna have to update it because things are moving and are in progress. So for example, City of Oakland, which I'm going to talk about at the end of today's presentation, has just adopted its environmental justice and safety elements. And so they're going to move into the implemented column. So things are moving, and it's our intention to keep this database updated. But this is where it is, and you can see all of those categories I was just sharing. So what are our findings? So of the 228 California cities with disadvantaged communities, we found that 5 were out of compliance. So that means that they had updated 2 elements in their general plan, but we could not find any evidence of an environmental justice element being adopted. 8 are in progress, but whether or not, it seems they're updating new elements, but implementation of SB 1000 is unclear. 94 cities, the law has not yet been triggered, so it means they have not updated 2 or more elements of their general plan, but we'll be keeping an eye on those cities. 55 cities, the law has been triggered and their SB 1000 implementation is in progress. And then a total of 66 cities have updated, the law has been triggered and they have adopted a new environmental justice element. So in terms of what we found these are examples of the actual, so this is the work Katie did in terms of finding each of these policies and pulling out of every single of these policies, these 66 policies, and putting them in our database. So for example, in Richmond, we saw evidence of policies that talk about how the goal will be achieved, what is the goal, how does it center equity, and how progress will be tracked, which all is important. I'm going to talk about the Office of Attorney General's new guidance in a second. It says that SB 1000 policy should be complete, right? So it's not just about putting the aspiration or the goal in the general plan, but there should be some mechanism to actually implement the policies and to monitor progress. Like that would be a complete implementation of SB 1000. And so we saw some of that in cities like Richmond, San Pablo. So they talk about financial incentives, attracting grocery retailers, targeting underserved areas of the city. So that those are evidence of equity, and then tracking progress. You see Fresno regulations and incentives should be adopted in the code for locating healthy food grocery stores. Again, attracting grocery stores in neighborhoods deficient in grocery stores and that don't have access to fresh, healthy food. So, very specific policies, and that's, in terms of looking at how well cities are implementing SB 1000, these are some of the things that we were looking for and that are categorized. And this is just a snapshot from our policy brief, which will be available after today's talk, which goes into more detail about some of the example policies that we think are model policies. So I've already mentioned Richmond's policy. San Pablo, they talk about partnering with regional community supported agriculture as an alternative source. So you have to go beyond the literature shows that just building, for example, a supermarket in a community does not ensure the community has access to healthy, fresh food. We have to do more. So they do in their plan. Anaheim talks about supporting the establishment of farmer markets and making sure that that access to healthy food is within a walkable distance of environmental justice communities. So those are some examples of model policies. The other thing that we found is that it was important to have a standalone environmental justice element. or at a minimum, if you are incorporating EJ policies throughout the plan, in your plan should be a chapter that summarizes all those EJ elements. We found that cities that had a standalone environmental justice element had addressed more of those food goals that we identified, including equity. So you can see the tall blue bars are cities that had a standalone EJ element, and the lighter blue are cities where it was incorporated throughout, but no separate EJ element. So there seems to be something about galvanizing policies when there's focused attention and it's called out in the plan. These are some of our other findings, and this is also a snapshot from our policy brief. So we broke down by each of the food policy goals, the cities that have implemented SB 1000 and that have not. And what we're finding is that SB 1000 makes a difference, right? So that's the column that's in peach on the, peach color on the screen. So this is the difference between cities with SB 1000 and cities without. So remember, cities have had food policy, looks like there's some connection going on. Okay, hopefully everything's okay and all of you on the Zoom are still with me. Remember, cities have had food policy and address equity to various degrees, but we were trying to see what is the influence of this new law. And everywhere except agricultural land, we saw that SB 1000 makes a difference. So if a city had implemented SB 1000, they were more likely to address food access, more likely to address nutrition, food production, edible landscapes, and equity in their general plans than without. When it comes to agricultural land, at first we were trying to think, well, why would it go down? But then it makes sense because a lot of cities do not prioritize urban land for food production, which is a major research issue that we're interested in at BFI. Some of my work has looked at that with colleagues like Jenny Soerwein and Lainey Siegner, former PhD student in ESPM at UC Berkeley. We've identified urban farms as vital city infrastructure that are important for food access and all kinds of health outcomes. And a lot of times, cities will, we value museums, we value parks, things like that. We don't necessarily value our urban farms and gardens and growing spaces, and yet they're so essential to health and community well-being. So that's something that we're interested in pursuing as well, in terms of just further intervention around how SB 1000 can and how cities can address urban agriculture and urban growing spaces in cities as part of this bill. I want to share a little bit from our two case studies of Richmond and Gilroy. So to complement the information in the database, we conducted case studies and interviewed officials and community organizations in each city. We found that both Richmond and Gilroy had pretty comprehensive and equity-focused food policies in their general plans. But it also illustrates, let's see. Okay, so it also illustrates how SB 1000 implementation can differ between urban and rural cities. So let's go into those. So this is just a snapshot of who we were able to reach more folks in Gilroy than in Richmond, but represented some folks who had worked on the plan. Some of the consultant cities often hire consulting firms to help with preparation of general plans, and then community organizations that were involved in the general plan. So I'll start with Gilroy, which is known for its annual Garlic Festival. It's an agricultural community in Santa Clara County, and it's on the southern edge of the Bay Area. It has a population of about 60,000. The population is mostly Latinx, and it leans Democrat, has at least one disadvantaged community, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture designates a significant amount of the city as being both low income and having low food access, which means most residents live more than a mile from a supermarket, which is the USDA's definition of food desert. And so we met with Mentor Harnish, which is a Sacramento-based consulting development firm, and found that Gilroy was actually one of the first cities to successfully adopt an EJ element after the passage of SB 1000. And so they held workshops with community members, and the biggest issue that came up in Gilroy was food access. That became a big part of their discussion. And so that's where a lot of their policies focus. Richmond, which is on the northeast shore of the San Francisco Bay, has a long history of environmental justice issues, long history of industrial land use. It had Navy presence and shipbuilding, post-World War II. Chevron is located there, the biggest employer in the city, but also a source of flaring and air pollution in the city. So a lot of environmental burdens for residents in the city. The refinery itself processes 245,000 barrels of crude oil a day. The population has evolved over the years. Richmond didn't go through redlining, but did have a history of urban renewal policies that impacted the city and also was impacted by white flight. And today the population is about 115,000 Latinx residents, and then the rest of the residents are equally split among white, Asian, and African American. Like Gilroy, a significant part of Richmond is both low income and low food access. Now, Richmond was one of the cities that had already had food policies. In 2012, their city council had adopted a health and wellness element, and as part of Richmond, they have a strong health in all policies approach, and they addressed environmental justice. And so in October 22, they built off that element of the health and wellness element and adopted a formal environmental justice plan. The interesting thing when we talked with, both cities have had turnover in planning staff, which is something we call attention to in the policy brief in terms of the need to engage communities so that these elements have a life beyond the planning process, and that there are champions that continue to push for implementation of the policies in the element. The interesting thing, we met with a representative from Planting Justice in Richmond, and even though Richmond has adopted a lot of important food-related policies in their general plan, they also express skepticism about whether or not these policies will really be funded, implemented, and actually realized, right? So there's still a lot more work to do. Now, we didn't do as many interviews in Richmond, and there's still more to do. We're still doing this work in order to understand the full scope of SB 1000 implementation. But that is something that we noticed, and something I'm going to talk about Oakland as well, and what Oakland may be doing right or might be a model when it comes to adopting an environmental justice element. So these are we also, although our maps are not yet published as the database, but we also have a GIS database associated because we wanted to look at the distribution spatially. And so we can look at, cities, which policies cities have adopted in terms of food access, nutrition, local food production, edible landscapes and agricultural land, and which haven't. The other thing we called out in our finding is that CalEnviroScreen, for all those 21 indicators, food access is not an indicator in CalEnviroScreen, but we think it should be. So what we found is there's not a perfect overlap between those USDA low income, low food access and say SB 535 communities, right? There are communities that don't have food access and there's significant low income population, but wouldn't fall under SB 535 or don't have that designation. And so food environment is a really important part of health outcomes. And so that's another thing we'd like to use this research to help advocate for food to be incorporated more formally into the state's main environmental justice screening tool. So our main recommendations so far from this research are, one, we found that having a standalone environmental justice element, it seems to be more correlated with adopting more goals and an equity focus in the general plan. So we highly recommend that so that food and equity don't get lost, right? Ensure that widespread awareness and participation occurs in creating the element. So where does that come from? So there might have been community engagement as part of creating the element, but when we went back to talk to community organizations, even the consulting firms, there wasn't necessarily a closing of the loop where the city goes back and tells everybody we've adopted this element and now we're launching and we're doing this thing. Like it just kind of stops with the plan. And so that's what we're driving at here. And improve the process to encourage follow through and on the ground implementation, which is really, really key. So getting those policies in the plan is important, but finding the funding, maybe you have to change ordinances, you have to change zoning, actually putting teeth behind the policies in these new environmental justice elements is really important. As I said, include those USDA food access metrics as part of our definitions of disadvantaged communities, provide example food policies that we hope this research will contribute to. There are other great toolkits in the state. There's California Environmental Justice Alliance, CEJA's toolkit on SB 1000. There's a new guidance from the Office of the Attorney General, and then OPR, and then I mentioned the SB 1000 toolkit. And then last but not least, food policy should be actionable, targeted, and specific. And then last but not least, prioritize racial equity and environmental food justice policy. So city's gonna have to go that extra step of identifying racial disparities or doing racial equity impact analysis as part of their environmental justice elements, because CalEnviroScreen does not include race or ethnicity as a variable, which is unfortunate because income doesn't capture fully the disparities that we see on the ground, right? And there's gonna be different kinds of disparities. It might be race and ethnicity linked to past redlining policies, discriminatory urban renewal policies, discriminatory real estate practices, exclusionary zoning. They all have a racial tint, not just in California, but across our country. And so it's an important variable, and cities need to do that as part of, we recommend that cities do that as part of their environmental justice screening. And we want to call attention to the Office of the Attorney General's new guidance on best practices for implementing SB 1000. We're happy to see that there's correlation between some of our recommendations and what has come out of this new guidance, which is, some of the things are about community best practices and community engagement. In terms of having a community advisory council overseeing the process of updating the general plan and adopting the new environmental justice elements. So you're getting community engagement throughout, doing deep, thorough, meaningful community engagement, which means developing the resources and materials so that the public can meaningfully participate in these plans, providing data in summary form, working on graphics, things like that, and making sure opportunities to participate are multiple and accessible. And the Attorney General also talks about, the policies should be complete. They should be targeted, specific. They should be, and there should be plans for implementation and tracking. So all of that and examples and models are in this new guidance. So we highly recommend people obtain those and cities use those best practices. And so as we close, I have 5 minutes left. This is pretty good. I think this is like 5 minutes. I think that's where we're at. I want to call attention to Oakland. So I'm working with Just Cities, which is part of my colleague Margaretta Lynn, who's a lecturer in city and regional planning in the Goldman School, and the co-founder of Just Cities is. Her organization is part of this collective of community-based organizations in Oakland called the Deeply Rooted Collaborative. And one thing I want to call attention to that I think Oakland is doing that's really innovative which is hiring a separate or having a separate RFP or contract specifically for community engagement. So they started this with the 2030 Oakland Equitable Climate Action Plan. They actually hired an equity facilitator, EJ Solutions, which is Mary Bell Tobias's organization. And as part of that process, her organization did a racial equity impact analysis for Oakland's climate action plan. And similarly for the Oakland General Plan, the city put out this RFP. And this time they went a step further. So for the climate action plan, that separate contract, the consultant was still reporting to the lead planning architecture firm, the technical consultant. This time in the Oakland General Plan update process, Deeply Rooted has their own separate contract with the city and their own separate channel with City Council, which is really important for ensuring that community voice is represented in the general plan. And so I'll just take you through a few things that I think have resulted from this different process for getting community engagement into the general plan. So I'm not going to read all this. You'll see the slides later, but you'll see some of the policies go further than what we've seen in some of the policies in terms of new healthy food grocers, community gardens, and then, so that's on the left, what the city proposed initially after its community engagement, deeply rooted, did additional community engagement, and the racial equity impact analysis brought out additional concerns, and there's an equity working group which serves as the community advisory council for this general plan update process. And so it was like multiple rounds of getting community input into the general plan. So that, it covers everything: community and home gardening, entrepreneurship and food innovation, and then in terms of additional community impact, entering long-term contracts with caterers, summer internships for high school students. Like, a lot of really good ideas came from the community, and more of these are incorporated into Oakland's environmental justice element than would otherwise be without this process. So you'll be able to read these in more detail when you see the slides after today, but we think these are examples. Now, not everything that came out of the racial equity impact analysis or community engagement made it into the general plan, but a lot did, and it's a pretty innovative, and the model that Oakland has is a good one, we think. So ending today by what's next for this project is continuing to track environmental justice and food justice through SB 1000 implementation, and our next set of findings are going to be around environmental justice and farm worker communities. Ongoing basis, we want to measure the impact of SB 1000 implementation. So are cities actually putting teeth behind these bills? What new funding, new practices, new ordinances are emerging? And then ultimately, what are the health outcomes associated from those interventions? And then engaging with communities across California on implementation of SB 1000 and other EJ laws. So I'm really excited working with BFI staff, Natalie Munoz, Sakina Shabazz. We're going to be going out to Richmond, sharing these findings back directly with community and engaging around what does the city need to do next to really implement and realize the vision around food access that SB 1000 was meant to promote. So, and we're going to also take our roadshow to Southern California next year as well. And before ending today, I just wanted to acknowledge my amazing collaborators, my research team, Susana Matias, who is a professor at Berkeley, both with environmental health and toxicology, and also works with Cooperative Extension, UCANR, and Katie Fallon, our amazing graduate student researcher who's now at BCDC. Super proud of Katie. And then immense thanks to Berkeley Food Institute and Hellman Foundation for sponsoring this research, and to all of the officials and planners and community organizations we met in the cities of Gilroy, Richmond, Oakland, and to the Deeply Rooted Collaborative for allowing me to share what the engagement was in Oakland today. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
For that fantastic presentation. I appreciate it. And we're going to go ahead and move on to Q&A. But before we do, I know that Sacramento Mayor Pro Tem Mai Bang is able to join us. So if you want to go ahead and stand so we can thank you for being here. Fantastic. Welcome. Thank you. All right. And with that, we'll go ahead and start Q&A. We'll do questions from the audience as well as questions on Zoom. Please make sure that if you are entering questions into the chat, that you go ahead and include your name as well as affiliation. If you're asking a question in the room, also name and affiliation, please. We'll go ahead and start with a question from in the room first, and then we'll go over to Zoom.